In our video number 18, we are going to discuss about excess demand and inflationary gap. The previous video number 17, we discussed about deficient demand and the deflationary gap. Here, we will learn about excess demand and inflationary gap. What is excess demand? Excess demand is when the aggregate demand is greater than the aggregate supply at full employment level of income and output. Now we learned what is full employment level of income. It is a situation when all the people who are able to work and willing to work get employment at the prevailing wage rate, and that all factors of production are utilized. Now, when the aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply, it generates a situation called excess demand. Let's try to understand this with the help of a graph. Now we plot on the x-axis the income and output, and on the y-axis we plot aggregate demand and aggregate supply. A 45-degree line is the aggregate supply or income. Now this is the aggregate demand line. We already learned that any change in investment would move this aggregate demand curve upwards. Or if you decrease the investment, the aggregate demand curve would move downward. Now if our actual aggregate demand curve is AD1, then point F, which lies on the AS curve, is representing full employment level. What does full employment level mean? That all the resources and all the people who are able to work and willing to work are employed. So this situation produces the maximum output that is possible in an economy, since all the resources are being fully utilized. Now, when the income of people increases, it could be due to change in investment, the income would rise. Now, when the income rises, the aggregate demand also rises. By how much? By this FG. Now, FQ is the equilibrium level of employment, income and output. But since there is a change in income, the aggregate demand would rise. By how much? By FG. So now the aggregate demand would be GQ. And this results in a situation of excess demand of GF. Because at full employment level, FG is the demand that AD equal to AS. Now the demand increases from FQ to GQ. And this is what GF causes the excess demand. And this results in what is called as inflationary gap. So what is inflationary gap? Inflationary gap is the amount by which the actual aggregate demand, this one, exceeds the level of aggregate demand required to establish the full employment equilibrium. Now how do we correct the situation? It can be corrected by decreasing the amount equal to deflationary gap. So if you reduce this gap, we again reach the equilibrium level of income, employment and output. So that would move the equilibrium from G to F. And once again, an equilibrium in the economy would be established. So since at this point, what we are calling this as inflationary gap, when the demand is greater than supply, the prices or the general price of the products would increase and would result in what is called as inflation. Hence, this is called as inflationary gap. Now, let's come back to this. When aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply at full employment level of income and output, we are calling it excess demand because demand is in excess. Now, what does it result in? It results in, just now we saw, inflationary gap or demand pull inflation. Why? Because it is that aggregate demand that induces a rise in the general price level. Hence, it's called demand pull inflation. The other result is that there will be a rise in general price level. When demand is more than supply, the prices of the goods and services would increase. Now, the impact of this excess demand in the economy would result in an income that would increase in nominal income. The real income remaining the same. Because it cannot increase because there is full employment level of output, and which is the largest output that the economy is capable of producing when all resources are fully utilized. Hence, excess demand would result in an increase in nominal income. Then what would be the impact on the output? We learned just now that the economy is already working at its full. So, there would be no change in the output. Then what would be the impact on employment? There will be no change in the employment as the economy is already working at full employment. Hence, there is no scope of creation of any additional employment. Then, we also learned that there will be an increase in the prices to bring down the demand to meet the supply, or so that the supply can meet the demand. Then how do we correct the situation of excess demand and the inflationary gap? This can be done by the fiscal policy which is undertaken by the government. That is, the government would reduce its expenditure. We learned about the government expenditure. How does the government make its expenditure? The various types of government expenditure include public works programs such as construction of roads, dams, bridges. Then on education and public welfare programs. Then defense of the country, maintenance of law and order. And subsidies to the producers with a view to encourage production. These are the types of expenditure that the government makes. So the government would reduce its expenditure on all these activities. When it reduces, the income of the people also reduces. And this reduces the aggregate demand, and hence we attain the equilibrium in the economy. Then the other fiscal policy is to increase taxes. By increasing the tax burden on the households and the producers, the government reduces the purchasing power in the economy. When the purchasing power reduces, the aggregate demand automatically goes down. And that's how we attain equilibrium in the economy once again. Then the monetary policy which is brought out by the RBI in order to decrease the money supply in the market. How does this do it? It does it by increasing the rates, the interest rates. What were the interest rates we learnt in the banking chapter? The repo rate or the bank rate, open market operations, cash reserve ratio, statutory liquidity ratio, margin requirement. All these were the quantitative tools used by the Reserve Bank of India in order to reduce the money supply in the market. Let's reiterate to ourselves what happens by increasing the rates. When the RBI increases the interest rates, the commercial banks are also forced to increase the rate of interest on loans. When the rate of interest increases, people do not go for loans. So this would reduce money in hand for expenditure, which reduces the aggregate demand in the market. And that's how an equilibrium is established. Let us now try to solve a problem. Let's say if autonomous consumption is given as rupees 100 crore and autonomous investment is given at 60 crore and the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, then calculate the equilibrium level of income. We know the consumption function C is equal to C bar plus BY, or C is equal to, now putting in these values, autonomous consumption C bar is 100 plus 0.8 MPC into Y. At equilibrium level of income, we know Y is equal to consumption plus investment. Now in place of consumption, let us write down 100 plus 0.8y plus investment, we are given 60 crore. Solving it, taking this y on the other side, we get y is equal to 800 crore. Now if full employment level of income is 1000 crore, we are expanding it. If full employment level of income is 1000 crore, is the economy facing excess or deficient demand? What would be the increase or decrease in the investment to reach the full employment equilibrium? Let's look at this problem this way. Here the full employment level of income is given. Full employment level of income is 1000 crore. And the equilibrium level of income we found out to be 800 crore. So, this full employment level of income is greater than the equilibrium level of income that we found out, if the MPC is 0.8. So, there is deficient demand. Required increase in income to combat deflationary gap would be change in income. What is a change in income? 1000 crore minus 800 crore, which is equal to 200 crore. Now what is a multiplier? Multiplier is, we learnt delta y by delta I, and we know delta y is equal to 200 crore divided by delta I, because this is the demand for the next question. What would be the increase or decrease in investment to reach the full employment equilibrium? Now here we have seen in this graph, a decrease or increase in the investment would move the aggregate demand up or down. So since we are talking of deflationary gap we learnt which is to the right of the AS curve. Now inflationary gap will be to the left of the AS curve. So in this problem we are facing a deficient demand, that is this side. So there is deficient demand. So what is the required increase in the income to combat this deflationary gap? 1000 minus 800, which is equal to 200 crore. Now what is the additional investment we have to find out, isn't it? So how do we find that additional investment? K is equal to delta y by delta I. K is also equal to 1 by 1 minus MPC. Since here we have two unknown terms, we can use this formula to find out the value of K. Put the value of K here, cross multiply to find delta I, or change in investment, which happens to be 40 crore.